think we're now ready to start. So just very quickly, welcome. I'm Zoe, Events Executive at Brand Finance. Thank you for joining our webinar today. We're very pleased to be joined by over 100 people from over 15 different countries. Following the release of the Brand Finance Football Annual 2020 last week, today's webinar will focus on discussing the most valuable football brands of the year. If you hadn't had a chance, please do take the opportunity to have a look at the annual online at branddirectory.com/football, where you can access a preview or purchase the full version. The discussion today will be led by Declan Ahern, Valuation Director at Brand Finance, Hugo Hensley, Senior Consultant at Brand Finance, and Andy Pottinger, Director at Bureau Happold, who I will be handing over to very shortly. Just a quick note on housekeeping. The format of the hour-long webinar today will follow a 30 to 40-minute presentation by Dec, Hugo, and Andy, followed by a 15 to 20-minute Q&A session. Please do submit any questions and comments to our presenters through the Q&A facility today. Just to let you know, we'll also be sharing a recording of the webinar after the session as well. We also kindly request that on leaving the webinar today, you fill out a brief survey providing feedback. That will be helpful to develop our future webinars in our series. And finally, I'd like to encourage you all to engage with us on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, using the hashtag #FootballBrands. Without further ado, I'm now very pleased to hand over to Declan to start the presentation today.
Thanks very much, Zoe. Just quickly, for those of you unaware of Brand Finance and who we are, I'll just give you...
You're a little quiet, Declan.
Sorry, thanks, Hugo. Just for those of you unaware of who Brand Finance are, I'll just give you a brief overview of who we are and the history of our football study. So Brand Finance was founded in 1996. We are a brand valuation and strategy consultancy. We're based in the City of London, right in the financial square mile. And we have a presence in over 20 countries worldwide. Part of our business is the publication of these brand valuation rankings, of which we do across approximately 30 sectors and 40 countries. We published our inaugural Brand Finance Most Valuable Football Brands in the World 15 years ago. And after kind of the intense excitement that the media provides the study, we decided to expand to an annual format in 2019. So this year is the second edition of that expanded study. So very quickly, just to cover the methodology, how do you value a brand? And this is not just a football brand, but any brand in general. We use what's known as the royalty relief methodology for our public rankings. And essentially there are 4 steps. So the first is that we need to determine the strength of a brand, and we do that using the brand strength index. This is a balanced scorecard which uses a combination of various performance metrics as well as our own internal research study. And I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into the brand strength index and the research in a few slides' time. But essentially we express the strength of a brand as a score out of 100. The second step then is deriving the brand impact on each of the revenue streams. So in a football club in particular, there are 3 primary revenue streams, that being matchday income, broadcasting, and commercial or sponsorship partnership income. So essentially what we try and do is determine how important the brand is in each of these different revenue streams, and that's typically expressed in the form of a royalty rate. The third step is then to forecast any future growth in these 3 revenue streams into perpetuity. And what we do is we assess any commercial deals that have been announced in the pipeline, things like stadium expansion, on-field performance, any likelihood of changes in large broadcasting revenue deals across leagues, in order to assess the prospective revenue growth across each of these revenue streams and for each club. The fourth step is then to combine it all using various valuation assumptions, things like a discount rate, tax rates, and GDP growth rates, and discount that to the present value, and that's what we call the brand value. So just to be clear, when we speak about a brand value, we are talking about the actual trademark and associated IP around that trademark. So here we have a slide just uncovering in a little bit more detail exactly what the brand strength index entails. So again, it's just a balanced scorecard that we use to determine the strength of a club's brand. And essentially there are three categories. So the first being brand investment. And we look at various metrics and attributes within that and various elements within those attributes. So things like squad investment, online presence, social media presence, investment into the stadium, for example. The idea then is that high levels of brand investment should translate to high levels of brand equity, which is the second category. And that is equity across all key stakeholders of the club, not just football fans. But part of the elements that make up the brand equity in this brand strength index is informed by Brand Finance's own football fan research, which again, I'll touch on a little bit later, as well as various other elements such as stadium attribute rankings, FIFA performance, league perceptions, and league ratings as well. The higher the brand equity, the higher, or it should theoretically lead to higher brand performance, and that encompasses more financial metrics such as revenue, price premium ability, the ability to generate revenues across all key revenue streams for a club. So this current brand strength index in its form uses 61 metrics. And again, we use an effective weighting system in order to express the strength of a brand as a score out of 100. So I did mention a little bit earlier about the Brand Finance Football Fan Research. We've conducted this research for 3 years now, and this year we've actually expanded the study a little bit further. So it now encompasses the 5 key mature footballing markets in the world, that being England, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy. And we also include 2 key emerging football markets, being the US and China, respectively. The research assesses trends in the consumption of football amongst fans, league and club perceptions, sponsorship effectiveness, as well as a range of other factors, as mentioned earlier, some of which are used to inform our valuations, particularly around the brand strength of each club. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Hugo, who is going to step through some of the results and the more interesting trends emerging from the 2020 study.
Thanks, Declan. So here's a graphic that anyone following our social media might have seen already. But I think it's worth another watch. This is the brand value of our top 10 football clubs since the inception of the project in 2006. Although, as you can see, Real Madrid were at the top then, a lot has changed between that measurement and our 15th iteration. You can see up till 2014, there were 3 Italian clubs in the top 10. But by 2014, their growth couldn't keep up with the Premier League, La Liga, and Bundesliga, and all had dropped out. But also that was the year that Paris Saint-Germain broke into the top 10 for the first time. You can see as well here that although there have been 5 Premier League clubs in the rankings the whole time, we've also had Spurs and Leicester jump in at different moments. And up to 2020, the total value of the top 10 is now 7.5 times the total in 2006. And this massive growth is a result primarily of skyrocketing broadcasting contracts and sponsorship deals, but also solidification of the top 10 as sort of an elite in the footballing world, and a step ahead of the competition in terms of brand strength. So here we can see that top 10 again, plotted across the last decade. And in 2010, the average value of a brand in our top 50 was 179 million euros. And by 2020, that figure was 431 million. And part of the reason European football is so popular is how competitive it is. And although we've had that amazing growth over the last 15 cycles of our valuations, there's been no club in the top 10 that hasn't at some point seen a decrease in valuation. And the impact of COVID-19 this year actually was a big part of the reason we saw 6 of the top 10 actually decrease in value over the year. So if we zoom out a bit and look at the top 50 for 2020, you can see Real Madrid and Barcelona top it with over 1.4 billion euros in brand value. Each of them 15 times more valuable than our 50th placed brand, which is Real Betis, although that still manages to be La Liga's 8th most valuable. And although you've got La Liga taking the top 2, the Premier League leads way ahead with 19 of the top 50 brands featuring, Norwich the only club in the 1920 season not to make the table. I'm hoping that Fulham don't do the same this year when they come back up and sort of can solidify a position maybe slightly better than last time. Those 4 clubs from outside the big 5 leagues, you can see are all in the bottom half of the table, each representing the top of their own league. So you've got Ajax from the Netherlands, Benfica from Portugal, Celtic from Scotland, and Zenit from Russia. Premier League's also well ahead in terms of brand value, and this is a combination of having obviously more brands than the other leagues, but also because the Premier League's big 6 all feature in the top 10, and that top 10 represents 57% of the total value of our top 50 of the ranking. So we move on to our other major piece of analysis. You get the brand strength index, and when we plot that against our brand value, you can see it's highly correlated, but both because it's an input, but also because it's such a strong driver of revenues for clubs. This also highlights that clear elite who've got that top level of brand strength, which boosts their brand value at a much steeper trajectory up to those top levels, with the Real Madrid and Barcelona at the top. And if we look at this correlation, you can see that that arrow that's popped up. If you had a brand strength of 72 and you're able to push that to 80, it would suggest you'd double your brand value, and that's strong brands such as West Ham, Newcastle, Seville, AC Milan. So just pushing your brand strength up to that next echelon would have a really strong effect. So next we're going to have a look at just how that impact is so outsized. So if we move on deck, we can look at the 3 primary income sources for teams that Deck mentioned earlier. There's match day, broadcasting, commercial. Obviously match day's income from selling tickets and merchandise at the grounds. Broadcasting is typically negotiated across leagues and competitions and then distributed. And then commercial revenue is an area where the strength of a brand really has an opportunity to grow revenues significantly through sponsorships and commercial agreements. You can see our top 10 again here, and although they have very varying revenue profiles, when we look at their brand values, you can see that commercial revenue really is the one delivering the majority of that brand value. You've got 62% of Real Madrid's value coming just from those sponsorship contracts, and that's up to 64% for Bayern Munich and 71% for PSG. So looking at the top 50, we can see that the highest ranking clubs are able to derive a really high proportion of their income from these commercial sources. But if we look specifically at the Premier League clubs, highlighted in blue on this chart, we can see they fall below the trend line. And that's because they're showing a smaller proportion of their revenue comes from sponsors and brand partners. This is partially a result of the Premier League's exceptional broadcasting revenues and the quite equitable way that they distribute them among the clubs. But it also indicates a gap where they could potentially be doing more to boost this revenue segment through promotion of partnerships and making sure that they're strongly aligned to the brand to keep hold and negotiate better contracts. So if we look at how clubs can work to improve their fortunes, we've got a somewhat simplified model of how there's a virtuous cycle that exists that if you can lock into, you can really start building up a lot of brand strength and value. So it starts with at any point in the cycle, obviously, but if we look here, you've got a strong team, which in turn delivers on-pitch performance, which will raise your brand strength, which can be used to attract better commercial partnerships, which obviously that income can then be reinvested in the team to help build up the cycle, and you hopefully are getting that accelerating return. So if we look specifically as PSG, a good example, they show how you can actually build into this cycle, not just straight from one aspect, but if you think they got a reasonably strong brand, attracted that Qatari investment in 2014, and then this they used to help build up the squad. As you can see, the squad value there starts rocketing right up as they get that investment. This delivered really strong, consistent on-pitch performance, and that ultimately led to a strengthening brand, which over time was able to increase that that commercial revenue by building up that merchandise and product sales revenue, which only kicked in really with strong growth in 17-18. So as we can see, these factors all come together to deliver really extraordinary growth for the brand. Although we've seen a slight stagnation recently, and that's as they've hit a bit of a ceiling in France, obviously winning the league almost every year. So what you need is to lock into that value chain and start trying to make sure it delivers for you across all areas. So maintaining the strong squad, but also really working to nurture the brand and making sure that it delivers to partners and they can see that the return that they're getting on that investment. And also maybe winning some European silverware would help too. Of course, we couldn't go through this year's results without mentioning COVID. I don't know how many people listening were on our last webinar specifically about those effects, but obviously it's disrupted much more than just sport this year. But based on the number of games behind closed doors, broken broadcasting contracts, missing sponsorship investments, we can calculate the damage that we think has happened across these revenue streams for the different leagues this year. You can see it's really hurting brands. It's also opened up a lot of questions for all the different stakeholders. So how do clubs supplement that match day revenue that's lost when there are no fans at the games? How do broadcasters ensure their investment in TV rights is still delivering an appropriate return? What part do clubs have to play in this? How can they maybe use over-the-top broadcasting to supplement that income when it stops that incredible growth that we've seen in broadcasting over the last few years? And how do clubs look after their partners to ensure that those partners are still getting the benefits of associating with the clubs when obviously fans can't be present in the stadiums and maybe schedules are changing very quickly? And how do they keep giving those sponsors access to those football audiences? So overall, we've got 751 million euros of brand value lost this year, specifically due to the effects of COVID. And that might seem like quite a small figure, but that just reflects how the value of these brands really exists mostly in the long term. So taking Real Madrid, the most valuable, as an example, only 21% of their total value is delivered by the results of the next 5 years. And the rest of that exists in the long-term future of these brands to be able to deliver value. So maybe it's not all doom and gloom there. So now we're back to Dec, who's going to walk us through some of the this brand strength and research insights.
Thanks, Hugo. So I thought it would be interesting to pull some of the more kind of interesting findings within the research and see how those findings tie back into both this brand strength index we've been talking about, as well as these 3 key revenue streams for clubs, but also looking at it from a commercial corporate sponsor point of view as well. So what we have in this slide is respondents in each country who identified as football fans, and these are not necessarily avid fans, but just casual football fans. And an interesting takeaway here is the large proportion of Chinese respondents who identified as football fans, so it's 46%. And it's marginally higher proportion than in England, France, and Germany, which is quite an interesting takeaway. Although, like I mentioned earlier, an argument could be made that the aforementioned markets have a greater proportion of the population that are more avid or hardcore football fans. Tying that into which competitions are followed the most, then you can see that only a fraction of people are following the Chinese Super League with 10%. The majority are following the Premier League and a Liga as far as domestic competitions are concerned. But with the Champions League being kind of the premier European footballing competition, the overwhelming majority are closely following that competition. Another way of looking at this data is which league is followed most on a country-by-country basis. So you can see, again, Chinese respondents, despite being or identifying as football fans, are obviously following leagues outside of their domestic market, the likes of the Premier League, La Liga, and Bundesliga. An interesting takeaway from this slide is that the Premier League has a lower following among English respondents than their counterparts in other European markets. Although a potential hypothesis or an explanation around this is, the breadth and depth of the English football leagues, like the Championship, League One, League Two, League Three, below the Premiership. So, in terms of which leagues are viewed as the best, and not just those that are followed the most, unsurprisingly, it does follow a similar pattern to which leagues are followed the most. You can see that the Premier League is viewed as the best domestic league in the world, followed by La Liga, then the Bundesliga, Serie A, League One, the EFL, the MLS, and then other leagues. Among other leagues, less than 2% of global respondents view the Chinese Super League as the best league in the world, and yet 10% of Chinese respondents view the Chinese Super League as the best in the world. So, the overwhelming majority are very heavily invested in the European leagues. So we often get asked the question if kind of the league you play in affects the value of your club. And this is definitely true to a large extent, as the perception of the overall league can influence the size of the broadcasting deals generated in those leagues, for example, as well as commercial deals, sponsorship agreements generated at a club level. So if we look at the Premier League, for example, which is voted as the best league in the world, this being for three primary reasons. So respondents firstly believe that it has the most passionate fans. You can see that with 58% there, followed by Serie A. Secondly, respondents believe that it is the most competitive league in the world. In fact, people view it as more competitive than the Champions League. And thirdly, respondents believe it has the most attractive brand of football being played, although that's very marginal, with La Liga closely behind. So you can definitely see why the Premier League has the largest broadcasting deal of any domestic league in the world and generates the highest commercial revenue at a club level as well. And those two factors are large reasons for the Premier League's dominance in the valuation rankings. So talking about that revenue earning ability, the Brand Finance Brand Strength Index is highly correlated with a club's total revenues. So you can see on the x-axis here, we've got the Brand Strength Index expressed as a score out of 100 for all the clubs. And on the y-axis, we have each club's revenue in millions of euros. Interestingly, you can see some of the football clubs we've highlighted here. The likes of Barcelona, Real Madrid, and PSG are really maximizing their revenue ability relative to the strength of their brands. Whereas the likes of Atletico Madrid and Valencia appear to be failing to leverage the strength of their brands to generate higher revenues for the team. Interestingly, Liverpool, on the other hand, appear to be pretty perfectly placed on the trend line between revenue generation ability and the brand strength of the club as a whole. So if you take a slightly closer look at commercial revenues, so sponsorship and partnerships, for example, and there are a few key metrics from our research that are more highly correlated with the club's ability to generate commercial revenues than other metrics. So the two metrics with the highest correlation to a club's commercial revenues are the club has a lot of star players, with over 50% correlation there, and then second is the club regularly challenges for trophies. So intuitively, this should make sense from a corporate brand's perspective, because the more star players a club and team has, and the more competitive a team is, the more successful that team is likely to be, the greater the exposure that team will get in terms of broadcasting, and then by association, the greater exposure the corporate sponsor brand is going to get. Hence they'd be willing to pay more and for those sponsorship agreements to the rights holders and to the clubs themselves. However, this kind of increased level of exposure worldwide does lead to significant sums of money changing hands from those corporate sponsors to these rights holders, which then leads to the natural question of whether these corporate brands are in fact getting a good return on their investment or not. So what we have on this slide is the sponsorship recall percentage from our research study. So we've asked respondents whether they can correctly identify the front of shirt sponsor or not for all the clubs within our study. And the highest recall percentage is that of Jeep and Juventus being the front of shirt sponsors, followed by Emirates and Arsenal, and Rakuten and Barcelona. However, this needs to be assessed relative to the annual value of spend that these corporate brands are paying these clubs. So if you take the recall percentage and divide it by the annual value of the sponsorship, you can then see how much recall is achieved per million of euros spent annually. And what this then shows us is that the likes of Jeep and Emirates are getting really good return on their investment, but the likes of Chevrolet are significantly overpaying relative to other properties within the market. Now, typically we would do this type of analysis not only on recall percentage, but we do it on a range of KPIs that we are covering in the research as well. The brand strength index is also highly correlated with match day revenues, although to a slightly lesser extent than overall revenue generation. Again, what we can see here is that Barcelona and Real Madrid appear to be maximizing revenue generation ability, and that's largely due to the sheer size of their stadiums that they operate in, whereas the likes of Everton and Manchester City are not necessarily earning sufficient match day revenues relative to the inherent strength of their brands. Digging a little bit deeper into matchday revenue distribution across leagues, we can see that the smaller leagues cannot generate significant broadcasting revenues or commercial revenues, and are therefore heavily reliant on matchday revenues. Whereas the larger, more established leagues, such as in England, France, Germany, and Spain, they are far less reliant on matchday revenues. And that's largely due to the high broadcasting deals achieved, as well as the ability of these clubs to generate strong commercial revenues. What this then says is that smaller clubs should be doing all they can to maximize matchday earning potential, as it is their most important revenue stream. But on the other hand, larger clubs for whom matchday revenue is relatively insignificant versus other revenue streams, they should also be finding ways to grow these matchday revenue streams in the future. So I think that brings me to a nice segue in which I can introduce Andy Pottinger and Borough Happold. So for the last 2 years, Brand Finance has partnered with Borough Happold, who are an integrated engineering consultancy, and they have developed a venue performance rating, which assesses the effectiveness of stadia across a range of metrics. So Andy is the Group Director of Sports and Entertainment at Borough Happold and specializes in venue design. And Andy's football credentials include work on the Etihad South Stand expansion, the brand new Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, as well as the new Everton Stadium. So with that, I'd like to welcome Andy and hand over to him.
Thanks, Declan. That's great. Can you hear me okay? Just stick your thumb up. That's okay? Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, this is going to be a little bit of a bombardment because there's a lot to go through, but we'll use the next sort of 10 minutes or so to sort of explain the methodology behind the stadium component of the Brand Finance Annual and the wider sort of picture around it. There's sort of three aspects of the venue performance rating, or VPR, as we usually call it. It's, first of all, it's several steps better than, or bigger than, other rating systems that are around, and it helps clubs to understand where the stadium sort of sits amongst its rivals. Secondly, it's the foundation that allows us to carry out specific deep assessments of existing stadia. And looking ahead, it's like the platform that gives us the capability to model future performance of new stands, stadiums, etc. Okay, but to step back a moment, if you move on, Deck. When we launched VPR last year as part of the annual last year, 2019 annual, and it was really well received, and so we decided to take it, a lot further, actually, in all honesty, and just kind of professionalize it, if you like, and we did a lot of development of the data set and expanded a few things that I'll show you in a moment. And phase 2 was launched on offthepitch.com, the sort of football finances website. That was launched back in June. Stadium of the Week there, as you can see, is like a fun sort of feature that we've got on there each week that relates to an upcoming fixture. But let's kind of go into more detail now and look at the methodology behind it all. And this is our outcomes wheel, as we call it. And the principle behind this dartboard, I suppose, if you like, is that you start in the middle with the overall score, and then you go outwards to ever more granular aspects. And so you sort of it's a journey into sort of trying to understand what leads to the ultimate outcomes. And so in the bullseye is the overall VPR score, but then around it you've got like impact, experience, and revenue. And then going out further, so let's just look at revenue, for example, match day revenue, broadcasting revenue, and commercial revenue. And a key thing there is that the numbers that you see against them are actually the weightings in the system. So 0.4 for match day, 0.2 for broadcasting, 0.4 for commercial. That's not about, we know that most top clubs broadcasting is massive, but this is about the stadium's contribution to these things. So that's an important thing to remember. But then going further down where you see the letter E, match day revenue comes from match day revenue generating features, the actual revenue per fan as it stands at the moment, a score relating to destination status. But then outside of that, there's 2 or 3 more rings here. So like on the next page, you can kind of get a feel for the sort of rich database that we've got. And so for example, with destination status, we've got 4 or 5 things that contribute to that, including things like, hosting major games over the last 10 years, how long the stadium has been around, all sorts of things like that, as well as the capacity and quality and such. And so there's a computational tool behind all of this, which you can sort of see a glimpse of that here. And that's where the power really becomes high, because we can sit with clubs and clients and adjust weightings and such to what their preferences are. And then I hate using the term in real time because it doesn't really know what it means, but sat there with them, we can kind of update it and take a look at what based on their own aspirations, what the scores are. So going on to the next one, another thing we've expanded is geometry. Geometry is really important for stadiums, and we know that from working on stadiums for the last 20 or so years, and there's 9 shown here, that are very recognizable, I think, and they allow us to make measurements of things like the compactness, spectator density, the average distance to the pitch. There's an acoustic engine within the computational tool that allows us to sort of pick any spot you like the penalty spot, for example, and estimate the decibels in that area, which is a really good thing to have. And then on the next page, you see, just to prove the point, that's just a snapshot from our kind of like, our SharePoint folder system that just shows all the different bowl models that we've got. And on the next one, a bit of an example of how you can build it up. So this is Goodison Park. So using things like on the left-hand side, you see the plan, or one of the plan levels. You see the cross-section of the Gladys Road end, and then mixing that all in together. On the right-hand side, you get the 3D model of the bowl that you can use in the ways that I've just mentioned, and things like get parameters like this. For people that have worked on stadiums that will be familiar with things like A value and C value. We've also got a few others like I value, which is a measure of intimacy, and torsion, which is like how much you've got to twist your head. All sorts of things that actually that are quite important to modern stadia, and to put it into the real life of Spurs. These graphics here show there isn't a bad seat at Tottenham, so that's why there isn't any red, but on here green is best, and then it goes to yellow and then blue, and it shows of how we can kind of measure these things for different stadia. And on the next page, there's the example of this is the Olympia Stadion where Hertha Berlin play, and on the next page you can see how that cross section emphasizes the fact that it wasn't designed for football. So there's a 40-meter distance at the end between the front fan and the pitch, and if you overlay that with some other stadia, you sort of see the difference there. Like, so on the closest stadia to it is the London Stadium where West Ham play, which is the sort of brown colour near to it, and then moving forwards you've got the light blue of the Etihad South Stand, the red of Emirates for Arsenal, and the dark blue is the single tier South Stand at Spurs. So you can see much closer. And so on to the next one. The final component of things that we've added is geospatial data, and so OpenStreetMap is a brilliant source of all sorts of good content, and it's as good as you want it to be in a way in terms of what you use it for. And so we're using it for the number of public transport nodes, the food and drink services that are around, the amount of public space, the accessibility and walkability to the venue, all sorts of things really. That's helped us to expand the experience sort of side of our rating system. Talking of which, this is this year's table of 60, with the top 5 being Spurs, the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, Principality in Cardiff, Wembley, and the Bernabeu. And then there's no limit to what tables we can kind of generate. So on the next sort of pages, you've got the components of experience broken into 3 leagues, and then impact revenue broken into 3 leagues, then impact broken into 3 leagues. And so in the coming years, we'll now have promotion and relegation, which will introduce a little bit of fun to it, and we'll see how Fulham get on in that. But anyway, and then in the fan survey that Declan sort of referred to, we used that very much to kind of calibrate and validate where we were going with VPR, because it can't just be sort of our own view on things. It's got to be a rounded picture. And so we asked things like what stadium would you consider to be the foremost destination stadium? Camp Nou, Bernabeu, Allianz, top 3, and then we compared that with what our scores were in the VPR and got a good correlation. These top trump cards give an indication of that. If you look at the annual, you'll sort of understand it a bit more. On the next question, we asked about the stadium most in need of redevelopment, because we're in the business of designing new stands and stadiums, so it's a good one to ask. And Stadio Olimpico, San Siro, Old Trafford. Interestingly, in the UK, more fans actually selected Stamford Bridge than Old Trafford. But another good one to see there. And then the next one is about what are the most important aspects of a stadium for the fans. And this is really interesting actually, in the accessibility and history with the top 2, especially across Europe. And it just shows, that it's not just about creating something that's flash. Really, there's a lot that fans care about. And accessibility and history are very important. Even to it's not just about that we've got it in different age groups. So even the younger fans care about history and accessibility. And so moving on to the next one, you it leads towards good discussions that you can have with clubs like, for example, Everton here, who we're working with for their new stadium on the Liverpool docks. How can the stadium influence the perceptions of the club going forward? How can you create write your own history, if you like? And Everton has done so much over its history to cultivate a strong reputation, rich in tradition, regionally rooted, down to earth, emotional, trustworthy, genuine, welcoming, brilliant sort of ratings across fans that can translate into positive sort of brand recognition and awareness and fondness. And that it's important that for the new stadium we keep all of that, enhance it if we can, but also bring them up on areas that they don't score so well in, like areas like dynamic and young and international. Stadiums can influence these things enormously. So that's what we've been working on with Everton. And then what we also sort of in the annual just mentioned a little bit of how we can bolt on the estimate of construction cost into this predictive modelling, because we've got a very good understanding of how much these things cost from our work over the years. And so, for example, Ellen Road, Olympia Stadium, Vitality Stadium for Bournemouth, there's different ways that they could spend the money if they had that money available. And so that just leads me towards the end now of, really it's this, we haven't just done that. It has been brilliant fun, but especially as a football fan, but we're doing this to actually help clients make informed decisions, better informed decisions than I believe that they're currently able to do, because it's often based on just very restricted things, just like advice on pure costs or programs and such. Whereas there's a much richer thing here, and everyone's different, every club's different, every fan base is different. So a stadium should be designed with different things in mind. And so for example, we could update the VPR tables based on tailored weightings to suit whatever preferences the club's got. We could do a deep assessment of the club's existing stadium, and adding in things like concourse experience, sustainability, and variable weightings. We could do a deep assessment of potential futures for them. Like I said, this predictive modelling idea, including the construction costs. We could develop expected revenue. I think most of you are probably familiar with like expected goals that are often talked about to rate strikers. We can talk about how much should a new stadium be expected to make. It's quite obvious that like Everton's new stadium will make more revenue than the existing one, but that doesn't mean it's overachieving. What should it really achieve? And then there's aspects like we can help to convey status in commercial and naming rights deals, because we can explain why a stadium is popular and good, and give it a bit of substance. And and there's so many questions that it leads towards that we toy with all the time. And it'd be great if people on this call could chip in with questions of their own. I'm sure you've got many. This is a platform that you can answer. Look into any sorts of thing. Even random things like, why do 10% of our fans leave before the final whistle? Why do how can we introduce safe standing over the coming sort of years, and whereabouts should we introduce it? How do you create a destination stadium? All those sorts. There's so many questions, and so this is what we've done is basically a platform that's there to be played with, if you like. And so it's up to the clubs, if you like, to kind of help us work out how it can best be deployed. And that's really it. Sorry, that was a bit of a whirlwind, but I hope that's okay. Declan, Hugo.
That was great. Thank you, Andy. I think it reiterates kind of the premise of our partnership as all, is that ultimately I think what we're trying to do is cover all aspects of football brands' finances. Those three key revenue streams, which is broadcasting, commercial, and match day. And I think including those VPR scores within our brand strength index has really helped us to make sure that we are covering that extremely key aspect of match day revenues. And we at Brand Finance would definitely argue that the brand is really key in terms of growing broadcasting revenue, growing commercial revenue, and growing match day revenues for clubs. But equally on the other side of that, for corporate brands getting involved in the sponsorship of these clubs, they equally need to be taking a financial and data-based approach in evaluating those partnerships and assessing what each respective sponsorship asset can give them in terms of returns. So I'd just like to remind everyone, I've seen a couple of hands raised. If you could please just use that Q&A function. So you should see it as a little button on the Zoom there. And please feel free just to pop your questions in there, and we're happy to answer as many of them as time would allow.
Okay, well, just as we're about to start the Q&A session, and thanks Dec, Hugo and Andy. We obviously, as Dec said, like to provide everyone with an opportunity to participate in the Q&A. So as Dec said, please do provide any questions or comments in the Q&A facility. But just before, I'd like to encourage all of you to engage with us again on social media with the hashtag #FootballBrands. So I think we can start with the first question. So we've had a question through, why is the table dominated by English Premier League clubs?
Yeah, so I think we touched on that a little bit earlier. It ties back into the cycle that Hugo was talking about. So the Premier League is viewed as a league that has the most passionate fans, that is the most competitive, and ultimately that leads to people wanting to engage with the Premier League in the forms of traditional media consumption like television. That then leads to higher broadcasting revenue generation. It leads to more commercial partnership opportunities for higher amounts, and all of that then gets recycled back into the club, who can again go through the cycle of squad investment and on-field performance, and just to kind of generate this flywheel. So the Premier League has been the league across Europe and or across the football world in general that has been able to do that the best.
Thank you. We've had another question through from our participant. How much more valuable are the NFL, NBA and MLB than the Premiership? And do you think that the Premier League can close this gap? And how would you suggest they would do this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the NFL and NBA, for example, have really been at the forefront of both broadcasting and commercial revenue generating capabilities. In fact, if you think about the NFL, they've also been at the forefront of generating match day revenues. Typically at a stadium for an NFL team, you'd spend 8 hours there a day. There's a cinema, there's a mall. You take the whole family day out for a day, and all those revenues are going back to those clubs and that league. So I do think that those two leagues in particular are significantly at the forefront of leagues worldwide, and are definitely ahead of the Premier League. I do think the Premier League are making strides in closing that gap, and definitely helps that in terms of global reach. Football as a sport has a much wider global reach than American football and basketball, which definitely puts the Premier League in good stead going forward. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, Hugo or Andy.
Yeah, I mean, our research shows how, although the US market is big, but it's also very rich, emerging markets are much more likely to view not just the Premier League, but European football leagues. So South America has huge La Liga following. The Bundesliga is also very popular in China, especially with things like China maybe clamping down on broadcasting of the Premier League. They will definitely see that as an opportunity to get in, and these leagues have much more potential in those growth markets, which is then following on, and you can see how many Chinese sponsors there are in the Premier League and how these things are building up. And as that support and wealth grows in those countries, you're going to see the growth potential, I think, for football and the Premier League particularly, is going to be higher than definitely than NFL, which dominates in the US market, but doesn't have so much expansion capability.
Okay, thank you. Another question come through. How have clubs responded well to mitigate the effects of coronavirus in terms of maintaining their brand value?
Yeah, well, look, that's a really interesting question, and I think some clubs didn't do unbelievably well on the onset of COVID. So, you think about big clubs initially announcing that they were going to furlough a lot of their staff. For those of you not in the UK, the furlough scheme is a kind of a government-funded scheme to keep employment levels across the country. And that received huge amounts of backlash. Other teams, came out straight away and said, they were going to guarantee all of their match day staff's income. So I think Manchester United have something like 3,500 staff members on any given match day. But with games being played behind closed doors, that match day staff, they were not needed anymore. But Man United did take steps to guarantee that income. We've seen huge strides since then in football clubs buying into like massive initiatives, particularly around their local communities, things like food banks and lending out their stadiums for various purposes, whether it's hospitals or homeless shelters. And I think those clubs have done a lot to kind of dispel the rumors of kind of the separation between the elite in football and kind of the common working person. The other aspect to think about though is that we touched on earlier is that some of these clubs are very reliant on one particular revenue stream, and when that revenue stream is under threat, then the club's sustainability in the future is under threat. So the kind of ultimate takeaway for clubs going forward is that they need to diversify their revenue streams as far as possible, and that's across all three streams. So that's match day, broadcasting, and commercial. And the more they can diversify each of those streams and grow them separately, the less reliant they'll be on one individual stream.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I think that was good. Other areas you see is clubs working really hard to look after their corporate partners. So both to keep contracts and show how much additional value they can give when they're not able to have fans at stadiums, and maybe the scheduling means that the value delivery of that sponsorship isn't in the period that they'd expected, or it's over a shorter term. And it was through, during especially the breaking games, giving access to things like training grounds, video calls with players in their houses, things like that allowed that engagement to continue and give sort of an additional view into the club, and sort of to show off those attributes that they're all trying to build. So competitive, close to fans, things like that.
Yeah, and there's actually a really good follow-up question kind of along that theme, where we've had someone asking what our thoughts are on clubs diversifying from traditional football clubs into broader sports and entertainment brands. And I think that is a very, very good question, and something we've given a lot of thought to. So, for example, we see clubs like PSG entering the esports space, the likes of Wolves entering the esports space, and that is a great way of kind of diversifying your brand, particularly into kind of the growing area that is esports, among other potential growth areas. And ultimately, expanding kind of beyond a football brand into those spaces can only benefit the club going forward. And we have research, part of the football fan research that I mentioned. We did actually ask a few questions around esports. And what we did see from that research is that emerging football markets like America, like China, fans across all ages are, they engage in esport activities, and either having watched it or played it over the last month. But also fans worldwide are, according to our research, very open to the idea of their football teams having an esports team, and that's not just necessarily a FIFA esports team, but other esports games like Dota, for example. So we would definitely recommend that for all clubs going forward.
I'd also say, Dec, as well, there's a bit of an opportunity in stadium design with esports, in the sense of, there's no reason why you couldn't have, say, one of the end stands as underneath the tier. You could have it being a sort of like a venue for esports. Being, if you did it right, you could actually create it as a second venue within your own venue. And if you could sort of grab that space as being the home of esports, particularly from a FIFA point of view, or a gaming point of view, then that might help you sort of brand as well, rather than just actually owning a team. You could actually be seen as a home. So that could be interesting as well.
Yeah, no, agreed. That'd be very interesting. I think it's a very exciting space.
Okay, we're getting so many questions through. I think we've got time for one more. So just wanted to ask, we've got a question from someone. Is there a correlation, or how important is a nation brand aspect for the football brand strengths, for the nation brands or destination brand image?
Yeah, so there's some metrics within the brand strength index that account for these. So, for example, Borough Happold's VPR rating takes into account, stadiums being seen as a destination stadium, and part of that, I think, is to do with a city or a nation's brand perception. Other ways that are not so explicit, though, naturally the culture of the people around football play a huge role. But if you take the likes of Brazil or Argentina, culturally football is such a massive part of the people in those countries and of those destinations as a whole. But those clubs have not had the ability to kind of leverage that inherent destination or inherent culture to kind of grow their domestic clubs and their domestic clubs' brand values going forward. Why that is, there kind of are a few reasons for that. What we have actually seen that's been extremely beneficial is, the likes of the Premier League as an organization was actually set up in the early 90s and broke away from the Football Administration. And what they did really well was to bind all these strong English teams together and get them to work in unison to generate higher broadcasting deals and other commercial revenue. And La Liga followed suit with that. I think it was in 2014, 2015, doing the same thing for the first time, kind of bringing the administration under La Liga and almost under Spanish football, if you will, to try and grow those leagues together.
Okay. Right, if we've actually just past 3 o'clock, so unfortunately we run out of time, but we've had so many questions through. But thank you for all the participants for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers, Dec, Andy and Hugo, for the very insightful presentation and for the very interesting discussion afterwards. I wish we had more time to answer more questions. We have shared the link in the Zoom webinar chat to the football annual, so do please have a look at the preview of that, and if you'd like to purchase a copy, that's available to download online as well. Also, I'd like to encourage all of you to complete the survey that will pop up at the end of this presentation. And to keep updated with future webinars, please visit our upcoming events on the Brand Finance website. And just finally, once again, thank you to Dec, Hugo and Andy. Thanks to all our participants today. We look forward to reconnecting with you all very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Perfect. Thanks all.
Bye.
Thanks, Eddie.
Thanks, guys.